For nearly a decade, Elias Marrow lived in the quiet spaces between applause, the kind of spaces where real work happens and nobody bothers to look. He was past 40, had learned to dress in suits that never called attention to themselves, and had perfected the art of standing slightly behind the people who loved being seen. His wife, Renata Vale, adored light, cameras, rooms full of investors leaning forward as if she were a prophet translating the future into quarterly returns. To the public, she was the architect of Luminary Bridge, a fast-growing talent brokerage that matched emerging companies with elite technical minds. To Elias, she was the woman who used to fall asleep on his shoulder while he explained cash flow models on a legal pad. What no article ever mentioned was that Luminary Bridge didn't breathe without him. He had assembled the corporate skeleton, threaded compliance through it like nerves, and built financial corridors that could carry millions without ever making a sound. He did it because he believed in her, or maybe because he believed in the idea of them, which is a different thing but feels the same until it doesn't. Somewhere along the way, gratitude turned into expectation, and expectation into absence, and absence into something colder. The night she accepted an industry award and thanked a man who wasn't her husband while never once letting her eyes drift toward Elias, he understood that invisibility had finally become erasure, and erasure, once recognized, has a way of demanding to be answered. Long before Renata, Elias had lived a simpler, more evenly balanced life with Mara Whitfield, an emergency physician whose calm in chaos had once felt like a miracle. They had a son, Theo, who now stood on the edge of adulthood with the awkward confidence of someone who still believed the world made sense if you studied it hard enough. The marriage had ended not with shouting or betrayal, but with maps spread across a kitchen table and two careers pointing in opposite directions. Mara's future was anchored to a research hospital on the East Coast, while Elias had been pulled west by venture capital and the gravitational force of new companies pretending to be ideas instead of businesses. They had separated like adults who respected each other too much to turn disappointment into war, and Theo grew up learning that love could change shape without becoming poison. That history taught Elias something important about endings, something Renata never seemed to grasp. That the way you leave matters as much as the way you arrive, and that ignoring the quiet work of maintenance eventually makes collapse look like surprise instead of inevitability. He met Renata at a private investor forum held in a glass and steel building that looked like it had been designed to impress people who pretended not to care about being impressed. She was sharp, recently disentangled from a marriage that had run on fumes for years, and carried an intensity that made strangers feel like accomplices in a shared secret. She spoke about building systems that didn't just place workers but reshaped careers, about turning recruitment into something closer to strategy than logistics. Elias recognized the familiar pattern immediately: vision without scaffolding, fire without a hearth. She had two children, Leela and Camden, both still young enough to believe adults always knew what they were doing, and an ex-husband who had drifted out of their lives more by neglect than malice. Elias admired Renata's hunger, her refusal to apologize for wanting more than survival, and when she asked for advice about corporate structure, he gave it freely, then more carefully, then with increasing depth until advice quietly became architecture. By the time they married, Elias had taken a senior role at a mid-sized investment firm known for making careful bets that looked boring until they paid off. Renata was operating out of a shared office space, armed with a pitch deck and a timeline that assumed optimism could substitute for capital. He didn't correct her. Instead, he built. He formed a parent entity that could absorb risk without attracting attention, arranged equity distributions that looked simple from the outside while protecting long-term control, and negotiated contracts that left partners feeling lucky without ever realizing how precisely the margins had been tuned. He wrote policies no one would read unless something went wrong and ensured that, if it did, the damage would land somewhere survivable. At night, she would thank him in small, intimate ways, the kind that feel truer than public praise, and he believed those moments meant more than headlines. It took years for him to notice that those thanks were becoming rarer, replaced by distracted nods and conversations interrupted by glowing screens. Success has a way of rearranging memory, and Renata's memory began to edit him out. Articles talked about her instincts, her boldness, her solo climb. Somewhere between one funding round and the next, Elias became a utility, as taken for granted as electricity or water, invisible unless interrupted. The company expanded, the children grew taller, the house got quieter, and the distance between husband and wife grew so gradually that it could only be measured in what they stopped sharing. When she hired Adrian Locke, a young executive with an immaculate resume and a talent for being exactly where cameras tended to look, Elias told himself it was practical. Every growing company needs someone who knows how to polish a story. He didn't tell himself the rest, that stories, once polished, often forget the hands that built the stage they're told on. It was Theo who finally forced the truth into the open, not with drama, but with the careful seriousness of someone who hates conflict and understands its necessity. They were eating lunch near his school, the kind of place where ambition pretends to be casual, when he admitted he had seen Renata at a private networking event with Adrian, standing too close, laughing too freely, touching in a way that belonged to evenings, not boardrooms. Elias thanked him for the honesty and promised, with a calm that felt rehearsed even to himself, that he would handle it. What he didn't say was that he had been handling it for months already, just not in the way people expect. He had learned long ago that emotion makes terrible strategy, and that the most decisive moves are often prepared in rooms that smell like old wood and patience. Weeks before the awards ceremony, Elias had sat with partners who trusted him because he rarely spoke unless he had already done the work. He presented them with documentation that read like a map of choices leading to consequences, undisclosed conflicts, authority granted without oversight, information that had wandered into the wrong hands and left footprints. The contracts Renata had signed years earlier were not romantic documents, but they were honest, and honesty in law is a sharp instrument. The vote to withdraw support was not fueled by revenge, no matter how easy that story would have been. It was fueled by obligation, by the quiet violence of fiduciary duty that doesn't care who sleeps in whose bed. They set a timeline that would look like coincidence to anyone who preferred not to see patterns, and Elias went home that night to a woman who spoke to him like furniture, while he finalized the last safeguards with the steady hands of someone closing a door he once loved. The ceremony itself was everything such events always are: expensive lights, rehearsed humility, applause that sounded like rain on glass. Renata wore a dress that looked like it had been designed to photograph better than it felt, and she told Elias where to sit without ever looking at him, already halfway inside a different room. When her name was called, she walked like a person who had practiced walking toward this moment in mirrors. Her speech was flawless, full of gratitude for abstraction and admiration for effort, and then she thanked a true partner while looking at Adrian, whose smile carried the confidence of someone who believed the world was finally agreeing with him. Elias counted 3 heartbeats, stood, and left. The applause followed him down the corridor like weather he no longer belonged to. By morning, the weather had changed. Phones rang with the particular panic of people discovering that foundations are not optional. Accounts froze. Partners asked questions that had only one answer. Renata confronted Elias in their kitchen with a voice that tried to sound like authority and landed closer to fear. He told her the truth without raising it like a weapon, that agreements had consequences, that she had signed them, that he had simply stopped absorbing the impact meant for her. When she asked if he had planned it, he said he had planned for it, and there is a difference that only feels semantic until you're standing on the wrong side of it. He told her he had already filed for divorce. The sound she made when something in her hand broke against the wall did not follow him out the door. Afterward, life did not become easier, but it did become clearer. Theo ate breakfast with him and asked simple questions that didn't need complicated answers. Renata's older daughter called weeks later to say she was leaving to live with her father, that she wanted distance from a story that had taught her too much about how ambition can hollow people out. Elias helped quietly where he could, not to be thanked, but because he had always believed that doing the right thing should not depend on applause. The company he had built from the inside unraveled in public, then in court filings, then in headlines that treated collapse like entertainment. He read them with the detached interest of someone watching a storm pass over a house he no longer lived in. Months later, standing in a different ballroom, Elias listened as someone else described the value of work done without spectacle, of structures that hold when the noise moves on. He thought about the years he had spent being useful instead of visible, and about how visibility, when it finally arrives, should be earned rather than stolen. When he left that night with his son, and the woman who had once been his wife and was now simply his friend, he felt something like gratitude without direction, a quiet sense that endings are not always losses, and that sometimes the most honest applause is the one you never hear because it happens inside, when a long argument with yourself finally goes quiet. In the weeks that followed the public unraveling of Luminary Bridge, Elias discovered that silence has a texture, a weight that changes depending on whether it is chosen or imposed. Reporters left messages he never returned, not out of fear but out of indifference. The story they wanted was simpler than the truth and far louder. He focused instead on the mechanics of unwinding shared life, moving books that had slowly migrated to Renata's shelves, dividing art that had been purchased during optimistic years, signing documents that translated intimacy into clauses and schedules. The house, once designed to impress guests who barely stayed long enough to notice the view, began to feel like a hotel lobby after closing time. Theo visited on weekends, and they cooked food that required attention, partly to keep their hands busy, partly because attention was a habit Elias was relearning. They talked about school, about applications, about the strange relief that comes when a conflict finally stops pretending to be avoidable. Elias didn't pretend to be unscarred, but he also didn't pretend to be broken. He understood now that there is a difference between losing something and being released from it, even when both experiences wear the same face. Renata's world continued to shrink in ways that were both predictable and oddly theatrical, as if consequences insisted on making an entrance. Former colleagues resigned with statements that tried to sound gracious while sprinting toward distance. Vendors demanded assurances that no longer existed. The office, once filled with the nervous optimism of people betting their rent on a vision, emptied into boxes and rideshare trunks. Through mutual acquaintances, Elias heard fragments, that Renata was arguing with lawyers about timelines, that she was sleeping poorly, that she was furious at everyone except herself, which was the most expensive mistake of all. He did not correct these stories or encourage them. He had learned that narrative is a currency, and he no longer wanted to trade in it. Instead, he put his energy into work that looked unglamorous and paid in stability, advising funds on how not to repeat the same mistakes under different logos. One afternoon, Leela called to thank him for covering a semester's tuition after accounts had been frozen, and for a moment, he considered telling her that he would have done it even if Renata had never been part of his life, because help should not be conditional on gratitude. He didn't say that. He told her to focus on finishing what she had started, because completion is a form of mercy you give yourself. She laughed, the way young people do when advice sounds both obvious and mysteriously difficult, and promised she would. After the call ended, Elias sat in his office and noticed, with mild surprise, that the room no longer felt like a command center for someone else's ambitions. It felt like a place where he could decide what came next without negotiating with ghosts. The investigation into Adrian unfolded with the slow, grinding choreography of institutions that move carefully because they move permanently. When the arrest finally made headlines, Elias read about it the way one reads about a distant storm, aware of the damage, grateful not to be inside it. A colleague called to ask whether he had known. Elias answered honestly that he had suspected and prepared, which is not the same as predicting outcomes but often looks like it afterward. The difference mattered to him, even if it didn't to anyone else. He forwarded the last of the requested documents and closed the file, feeling a kind of procedural relief that had nothing to do with vengeance. If anything, the episode reinforced what he had always believed: that systems fail not because people are dramatic, but because they are careless with details and arrogant about consequences. Renata tried once more to see him. Months after the collapse had become a routine rather than a headline. She looked smaller, not physically, but as if her posture had finally caught up with the weight of her decisions. She asked for advice, not money, not favors, just direction. And for a moment Elias considered giving her the same structured guidance he had once offered with such patience. He didn't. He told her that rebuilding requires accepting that some bridges are not meant to be repaired, not as punishment, but as architecture. She left with the expression of someone who had been hopping for absolution and received instead a map back to herself, which is harder to follow and impossible to outsource. When the door closed, Elias felt neither triumph nor regret, only the quiet finality of a chapter being shelved. Work filled the spaces where argument used to live. Elias helped structure a clean acquisition of Luminary Bridge's remaining assets by a competitor that understood the difference between data and reputation, and insisted on terms that protected employees who had been caught in the collapse without understanding the engineering beneath it. The deal was not poetic, but it was precise, and precision has its own ethics. He took on fewer projects and chose them more carefully, favoring founders who asked difficult questions early instead of flattering ones late. In meetings, he spoke less and listened more, not because he had lost confidence, but because he had learned that confidence does not need to announce itself. Theo's acceptance letter arrived on a quiet morning that smelled like coffee and clean paper. They read it together, twice, then a third time, as if repetition could turn possibility into proof. They celebrated with food that was too rich and plans that were too ambitious, and Elias felt a pride that was unencumbered by performance. Later, Mara called to say she was proud of both of them, and they talked like people who had shared a long road and chosen different exits without turning the journey into a grievance. Her life had expanded in ways his had not, and his had deepened in ways hers could not, and neither of them needed to pretend that one was better. The award season came around again, as it always does, and this time Elias found himself in rooms where applause was directed at teams rather than individuals, at processes rather than personalities. When someone thanked him publicly for work he had done quietly, he accepted it without flinching, not because he had learned to crave recognition, but because he had learned not to refuse it when it was honest. He thought about how easily gratitude can become currency, and how carefully it must be spent if it is to remain real. After one ceremony, he walked outside alone and felt the strange lightness of someone who no longer needs a stage to confirm that he exists. He stayed in touch with Leela and Camden in the careful way adults do when they want to be supportive without becoming substitutes for parents. They sent updates about classes, about small victories, about the slow process of deciding who they wanted to be without inheriting anyone else's unfinished wars. Elias responded with encouragement that was specific rather than sentimental, because specificity respects effort. When they visited the city, they had coffee and talked about ordinary things, and he noticed how ordinary had begun to feel like a luxury. Time did what it always does. It edited the sharpest edges into something more usable. Renata found work that paid less and demanded more, and for a while she tried to convince herself that humility was a temporary assignment rather than a permanent skill. Elias wished her no harm, which surprised him less than it would have a year earlier. He had learned that wishing someone well does not require reopening doors, and that closure is not cruelty. It is maintenance. On a late evening, standing on his balcony with the city making its patient, indifferent noise below, Elias realized that the story he had been living inside had finally become his own. Not because he had won, not because someone else had lost, but because he had stopped building rooms for other people to stand in. He thought about Theo, about Mara, about the quiet competence that had always been his native language, and about how close he had come to mistaking invisibility for virtue. The air felt clean. The future did not look loud, but it looked workable, and for the first time in a long while, that was more than enough.